vehicles, and funding it with stocks and bonds and cash, not FLPs and valuation discounts, and saying, well, we're going to make this look like it's worth something less. And that's what I really like about it is the simplicity. I'll get more into this other item in a minute in another section, but the RPM income trust can be used as a QPERD alternative. So instead of funding this with stocks and bonds, maybe we do put the house in and the kids pay for the remainder. But we'll talk about that later on. So the other version of this trust is the RPM annuity trust. The annuity trust is about as different from the income trust as a charitable remainder trust is from a charitable lead trust. They're very, very different. Both serve to transfer wealth to the kids, but the math is very different from one another. The RPM annuity trust is just like the other one. I transfer assets to this trust. My kids pay me for the remainder, but instead of my wife getting all the income, she gets annuity. So it's like a spousal grat. So the other one was a grit for my spouse. This one is a grat for my spouse. And the math is just like a grat. So if I put $1 million in and we set the annuity so the remainder equals $45, then the Dynasty Trust pays me $45. So it's just about zeroed out, but not exactly, so that they can pay me. And she gets an annuity for 5 years or 10 years or 20 years for that matter. And at the end of the term, they get the balance. And the game here is beat the 75-20 rate, just like the grat. But the difference is we don't have the mortality risk. If I die during the term of the annuity, nothing happens. I'm not a party to it. I got paid. I got my $45. I'm happy, somewhat happy. And I'm not a beneficiary of the trust. I'm not a party at all. So there is no transfer with the retained interest that 2036 would apply to in the case of a grat. I said, here's your annuity. You pay me $45. I'm going to go spend it on dinner, and I'm done. And if I die, hopefully they'll care a little bit, but they won't care about the strategy. My spouse remains the beneficiary. It's not included in my estate, so we take away the mortality risk, which also makes us say maybe we can make this spousal grat longer than we would do a regular grat. So in a regular grat, we might do 2 years, we might do 5 years, we might cross our fingers and do 10 years. A lot can happen in 10 years. But are we going to do 15 or 20? I don't know. It would be nice to do that, especially when the 75-20 rate's only 1%. Lock that rate in for a long, long, long time. But you've got that mortality risk. And we also have, when a grat ends, the remainder is not going to be GST exempt. By definition, the ETIP rules apply. Here we have a Dynasty Trust taking $45 out of its pocket and saying, here, I'll invest that in this spousal grat, this RPM annuity trust. And if it turns out to be successful, the 45 turns into hundreds of thousands or millions. And if it's not, then it made a bad investment with $45. But whatever it is, it's going to be GST exempt. So we now have a grat that's GST exempt and without mortality risk, and one where we can make the term much longer than we otherwise might have done. But again, you need to be married, and your spouse is going to get that annuity whether or not you're married after the fact. I had one client, we timed the annuity payments so it's payable on his anniversary every year. So he is covered for 15 years. If we look at the numbers, so just a quick example, you see in your materials, so $10 million going in, got a nice rosy 10% annual return. The annuity is about $1 million a year for 10 years plus some change for to zero it out or near zero it out. And at the end of the term is $9.5 million. And in this case, so we funded the trust with $10 million. My rate was 5.8%, 15 years, and we set it so the remainder cost $10,000. I don't like doing $45. I think maybe it should be a little more meaningful than that. But we could. We can make a grat zero. We can make a grat $1 remainder. We can make a grat $10,000 if we want. So I've usually done it around $10,000 or more, depending on what we're putting in play. And if you do the math, if we set up a grat that pays this annuity, or if we do the math, say I'm putting $10 million in, here's the rate, I want the remainder to be $10,000, the programs will kick out and tell you, oh, the annuity should be $1,015,000 a year. And if that's what it is, and we have 10% growth, it turns into $9.5 million. So the trust invested $10,000 and got $9.5 million. Again, in this case, the investments cooperated and made 10% a year for 15 years. This one does have a hurdle, just like any GRAT does have a hurdle. If we only earn 75-20 rate, it's not going to be a successful strategy at the end of the day. The other thing we can do with this one is get a windfall out of it as well. So we can do this 15-year fixed term like we do in a GRAT and not have the mortality risk. Or I could set this up so it is payable for 15 years or until my wife's death, if sooner. In that case, number one, the remainder costs a little more. They're paying for the possibility that they might get the assets sooner. And the older my wife is and the longer the term, the more they'll pay for that. But the upside is, if spouse dies early, they get the assets and the rest of the annuities are not paid. That can be very, very significant. In this example, you see $10 million growing, and at the end of the year, in year 9, there's $9.8 million in the trust, and there's still 5-6 annuities of $1 million left to pay. If a spouse dies early, they get the $9.7 million at the end of year 9, and they don't have to wait 6 more years for $6 million more to be paid out of the trust. It's a windfall. And it turns out, actually, one of the first 2 of these I did for a couple in their 80s, an RPM income trust. One created an income trust for the other, one created an annuity trust for the other. And it was different assets and different cash flow and so forth. It was part of the rationale. And in both cases, they were for spouse's life or until death if sooner. And both were healthy, weren't anticipating untimely death. And actually, the terms in their cases were relatively short, 7 or 8 years. So we weren't going out to age 100. One spouse actually fell ill a year or 2 later and passed away. And then the other spouse followed about a year after that. And turned into an enormous windfall, especially on the annuity trust, because we paid 3 or 4 annuities, and the last 3 didn't have to be paid at all. These were reported on gift tax returns. We said, here's the transaction, this is marital deduction, they paid for this, here's the trust. We actually reported on their estate tax returns as well, because we had a stub income payment. We had a last annuity payment still due to the spouse's estate. I think the second one was audited. The second spouse's estate tax return was audited. They asked 1 or 2 questions about it, and that was the end of it. It helps, by the way, I think, when you're setting up these trusts, to call them marital trusts. When the IRS sees the Jones Marital Trust, they say, okay, where's the FLP? I just think they're not necessarily looking for things called marital trusts, especially if you say, by the way, this qualifies for the marital deduction. Nothing to look at there. But even if they did look, they wouldn't find anything. The other thing you can do with this annuity trust, so we can make it the shorter of, we can make it GST exempt, it gets rid of the mortality risk, but we can backload the annuity if we want to. So we know in a regular GRAT, the annuity can be equal payments, or it can be increasing payments, but it can only increase up to 20% per year according to the regs. So you can't have the first payment be $1 and the second payment be $10 and then 20 and double every time or anything like that. And that would be nice to do because that leaves more money in the GRAT for a longer period of time. Maybe we don't have the cash flow to fund those annuities. That buys us more time to build up liquidity. But in an RPM trust, it's not a GRAT. We're not in 2702. We're not subject to the GRAT rules. There is no transfer with retained interest. And we'll talk about that in detail in a minute. So because we're not in 2702, this doesn't have to meet the test of a, quote, qualified interest. We're not subject to this 20% annual cap on the annuity increases. So if we wanted to, we could structure this to increase, start out at $1 and double every day or double every year for 25 years. It gets pretty high if you just start with $1 and do it for 25 years. It gets into the millions. But we could really backload this, and that can be helpful in 2 fronts. One, we leave more money in the trust for a longer time, hopefully beating the 75-20 rate during that time. So the more that's in there, the better. And second, it may help on the practical end of, we don't have cash flow right now, but we plan to sell this business within 5 to 10 years. or we will build cash flow over the next 15 years and we'll be able to pay it, but right now we can't. And if you look in the materials, I have an example with $10 million going into this annuity trust, and the first 14 years, the annuity is $10,000. So we do pay an annuity, and it's just $10,000 a year for 14 years. And the last year, the 15th year, it's $23 million. And the way I came to that number is, again, I used the 5.8% rate, and it's 15 years. And so we want an annuity stream where the present value of all those payments, so $10,000 year 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, plus a balloon payment in year 15, the present value, we want that to equal the $10 million we put in, or $10 million minus, say, $10,000. So the remainder is $10,000. We want the annuity to equal $9,990,000. And if you do the math, this annuity stream has a present value of $990,000 present value. You got to do a $23 million payment in year 15, so that's a big catch-up, but that's because you weren't paying millions of dollars every year for 15 years. But now let's look at the numbers. So the same 10% growth in our first example, let me flip back a page, where we had the annuity trust, $10 million, fixed annuity, 10% growth, $9.5 million remainder. Not a bad day. If we have the exact same assets, exact same trust, but backload the annuity, exact same rate of return, the remainder is $18 million. We pretty much doubled it because more stayed in the annuity trust for a longer period of time. And in this example, it happened to be beating the 75/20 rate every year. And so that compounding for all that time turned into $18 million instead of $9 million. So it serves a practical purpose of maybe we don't have the cash flow, and it also serves the benefit of potentially doubling the wealth transfer over the same time period for the same assets. That other $9 million, it was there. It's just that it happened to be back in the spouse's pocket because they got the annuity payments all those years. Here, we're not putting it in the spouse's pocket basically until the last day of the last year. Here's your $23 million check, and then the kids get their 18.4, or the Dynasty Trust in this case invested $10,000 and got $18 million. Again, these numbers sound phenomenal because I've got phenomenal rates of return, but you can scale it down accordingly as well. So again, the advantages of this compared to other techniques. So no mortality risk as we would with a GRAT. This can be GST exempt, which a GRAT would not be. We can structure it to have a possible windfall if you do a shorter of term as opposed to a fixed term. And you can backload the annuity payments to either for practical purposes or to increase the benefit. And the same rules apply for the 75/20 tables here. In fact, it's even easier. The 75/20 tables say you're supposed to use them unless it's unrealistic and unreasonable. And the burden's on the IRS to say that we're not supposed to. And the annuity, we know there's annuity tables, and these are annuity payments. And so we're in the same position. One issue we have is valuation. It's one thing if we fund this with cash, and the remainder trust pays me with cash. There's no valuation issues. It's strictly IRS tables. What if what I put into this trust is closely held stock? We think it's worth $10 million. We got an appraisal saying it's worth $10 million. But the IRS might come back a couple years later and say, that wasn't worth 10, it was worth 12 or 14 or 10 and a half, even 10.1 billion. So off by $100,000. What's the result? Because we have the marital deduction contingent on the remainder trust paying full and adequate consideration. What if we're off by $1? What if the $10 million wasn't right, and therefore they shouldn't have paid me $100,000 or $2 million? They should have paid me $2,025,000. Do we lose the entire marital deduction? That's my biggest concern. So I researched this, as you might imagine. There's nothing directly on point. The closest thing on point is a technical advice memorandum from 1976, which basically supports the notion that if you're off by 2%, then 2% of it won't qualify for the marital deduction. It doesn't disqualify the whole thing. The only reason I hesitate is there's only been one ruling in 35 years and nothing else, so I'd like to see 10 of them before I sleep well at night. So there is an issue. So if we fund this with something that's not cash or publicly traded securities, where there is a valuation issue, it's unclear if we're off. And I don't want to be off because we don't want to lose that marital deduction. That would be a bad day. So there's two solutions. One, fund it with cash and marketable securities. You can always turn around a day later, a week later, a year later, and have the trust buy the closely held stock. But on day one, the gift to the spouse qualifies for the marital deduction if we know we have the value certain. We fund it with cash, you use the tables, you know you have the deduction because we know exactly the values. There's no issue. If a year later the trust takes $3 million out of its pocket and says, David, I'll buy some closely held stock from you, and the IRS says later on, that wasn't worth $3 million, that was worth $3.1 million, there's no marital deduction issue. It's solely an issue of, did I sell something to this trust for less than adequate consideration? And if I did, it's the $100,000 difference. We got the marital deduction when I funded the trust. That's done. So did I make a transfer to this trust? Did I sell something for $100,000, for $3 million, and I should have sold it for $3.1? It would be a $100,000 gift, not the entire marital deduction at the outset. The other way to solve the issue is fund it with closely held stock and have the dynasty trust pay for the remainder with the same form of stock. So I've got a closely held company. This trust already owns some stock in that company. I'm now going to take some more shares in that company and put it in this RPM trust. And this trust over here is going to pay me not $10,000 in cash or $2 million in cash. It's going to give me $2 million worth of the same stock of that same stock. So if you do the math, and I've done it with lots of spreadsheets to make sure, if the IRS says that stock you put in the RPM trust is worth 10% more, well, that means the remainder trust should have paid 10% more. But guess what? If this stock is worth 10% more, this stock is worth 10% more. So automatically, they've paid the right amount. So if they should have paid, and this is worth 10% more, then so is this, and the adjustment is automatic. So paying the same currency, or fund it with cash and marketable securities, and then you can always turn around and swap for other assets of equal value. So last we come to, almost last, 2702. Does 2702, Section 2702 apply to this? And the answer is no, and C, and a second no. First of all, 2702 says if you transfer property to a trust and retain an interest in the trust, transfer property to trust for other people and retain an interest in the trust, then the interest you retain is valued under 2702, and if that interest is not a qualified interest, annuity, unit trust, Cupert, then my retained interest is valued at zero. So that's why you can't do a GRIT. I can't put $1 million into a trust, say I'll get the income for the next 10 years, my kids get the remainder, because that's not a qualified interest. It would be a gift of $1 million under 2702. So first, 2702 does not apply here because I didn't retain anything. I transferred the income or annuity to my spouse. I sold the remainder to my kids. Let me just grab water. I sold the remainder to my kids, and so I didn't retain anything, and 2702 on its face doesn't apply. In fact, 2702 did us a favor and hammered the point home by defining the word retained. Couldn't ask for more. Retained means held by the same individual before and after the transfer. Because someone might have thought to himself, okay, retained, well, I didn't, but my spouse did. Is that close enough? No, same individual. Then we have an example. Love examples in the regs to hammer home our point. If a grantor transfers property in trust that pays all the income to his spouse for life with remainder to his children, 2702 does not apply because neither the grantor nor the spouse held an interest before and after the transfer. Couldn't have asked for anything better. This is the RPM income trust. Transfer to spouse, income, remainder to the kids. I didn't retain anything both before and after. Doesn't apply. Then we get to 2702C. It's the so-called joint purchase rule. And that rule says if I transfer property to a trust and there's a term interest for one family member and a remainder interest for another, spouse, kids. So far we're in there. The family member acquiring the term interest, my wife, is treated as having acquired the entire property, and then she transferred it into the trust. And then you apply 2702. You say, uh-oh. So we're going to treat this as if my wife transferred it into the trust, she retained the income interest, and gave the remainder to the kids. So it sounds like 2702 is a problem, but then they have one last sentence at the end of C that says that the gift caused by the joint purchase rule, so if my spouse is treated as making a gift, will not exceed the consideration furnished by the term holder for all interest in the property. So her gift cannot exceed what she paid for her interest in the trust. And this is what she paid for her interest in the trust. So the gift is 0. So under the definition of retained, 2702 doesn't apply. Under the joint purchase rule, since my wife doesn't pay anything for her interest, it's a gift. The gift, according to the rule, is limited to what she paid, and therefore it's 0. In fact, if it weren't for that rule, you could not do in a lifetime Q-tip marital trust. If you think about it, if we didn't have this exception in the joint purchase rule, if I transfer property to a lifetime Q-tip marital trust, my wife gets the income for life, remainder to my kids, 2702 joint purchase rule would say, we're going to treat your wife as if she transferred the assets to the trust, retained an income interest, remainder to the kids, that looks like a grit. She just made a taxable gift. We know that it's not a taxable gift. That's called a marital gift from me to my wife. And the joint purchase rule, that exception saying, wait a minute, her gift is limited to what she paid, it's 0, never mind. So 2702, after much hand-wringing, is not a factor at all. A couple other points. Gift splitting. If you do one of these transactions and you're splitting gifts, it's really a non-issue. No part of this is going to qualify for gift splitting anyway. You can't split a gift for an interest transferred to your spouse. So there's two gifts, there's two transfers here. One is to my wife. You can't split that gift by definition. And then the other transfer is to the dynasty trust, and that's not a gift either because they paid me for it. So this part isn't a gift. This part can't qualify for gift splitting. So as far as reporting and being concerned about it, it's not going to be a split gift. There's also the grayed-out case, and you hear less and less about this, but that was a case that basically said you can use the tables for valuing gifts, the annuity tables and annuity and income tables and so forth, but when it comes to valuing assets including the estate, we don't have to follow the tables. So we have three responses to that, or a few responses. One, there's 3 circuit courts that have rejected the case. And second, grayed-out was decided before there were floating rates. And third, all the cases that the case that grayed-out involved, it was a pre-Chapter 14 case. So, the other point is grayed-out said this is included in 2036, and how much is included? 2036, as we know, doesn't apply at all. Grayed-out was a 2036 case, and since 2036 can't apply to the RPM trust because the grantor doesn't retain an interest, it becomes a non-issue. Timing of the transaction, so I've mentioned that. It's critical that it happen the same day. It can't be, I'm going to put this in the trust for my spouse, and a week from now I'm going to call up the trustee of the dynasty trust and see if they want to buy it from me. Because if you do it that way, then you just made a gift to a trust for the spouse. They did not pay for the remainder. You don't know if they're going to, and it doesn't qualify for the marital deduction because they didn't pay for the remainder and it's not a Q-tip trust. So it needs to happen at the same time. It needs to be, we're all sitting at the same table, signing the same trust. I'm putting this in. Spouse gets an annuity or an income interest. Dynasty trust is going to pay me X dollars. I have the dynasty trustee sign the agreement. Part of it says this is what's happening. Should all happen at the same time. Transfer the assets on the same day. I mentioned can't have a divorce clause. At the spouse's death, what happens? If my spouse dies, 2036 doesn't apply, we know. She didn't transfer anything and retain an interest. And 2039 doesn't apply. 2039 says if we're getting an annuity and someone else is going to receive that annuity because they survive you, or in this case, maybe just a single payment. That can be included in your estate, but 2039 also has an exception saying the amount included is only proportionate to the consideration paid by the decedent. Well, spouse didn't pay anything for their interest, so 2039's inclusion is zero. So it sounds pretty good. I think it is pretty good. I haven't been doing as many of the income trusts in the last few years as you can imagine because interest rates are so low that they're certainly less attractive. And we can be doing low interest loans and very low interest grats. And when we were jumping up and down that the 75/20 rate was only 2%, now it's at 1%. It's pretty phenomenal. So I'm going to open, before I go to the next piece, open the floor if there's any questions. You can ask later as well. Question?
Can you loan the money to the Dynasty Trust to purchase?
As you can imagine, there's no rules or cases on this. So what if the Dynasty Trust has $1 million, but we need $3 million to buy the remainder? I don't see why you couldn't lend the money. I tend to avoid it, just fewer issues, less for the IRS to look at and challenge. How would this